This is a production of Cornell University.
I'm going to take you on two whirlwind tours of the garden. One that shows the weaknesses of the garden, and one that I hope shows our strengths. I'll then try to slow down and talk a little bit about the context of this garden, both in the past and today. And the last part, I hope that Don Racco will appreciate it. The last part of my presentation will be about our attempts to respect the past and prepare the future. That is to say, how do we cultivate this space? How do we cultivate a historical garden, and why do we do it that way? What, is it the same as in the past or not? In some sense, it's public garden management. So here's for a whirlwind tour of the garden, first with its weaknesses, then with its strengths. First weakness is when you work in the garden, that's what you see. If you walk up the ramp, that's what you see. If you walk down the steps on the other side, that's what you see. If you go look up, that's what you see above the peach trees. If you keep walking, you go through a door and you see a wall without trees that seems to be falling, well, not, let's say, just unkempt. If we go to the back of the garden, you start seeing that the tops of the gardens, the tops of the walls are not so good either. The bottoms of the walls, neither. That's not good English, but I'll survive. The walls are separating. When we're against the trees, we haven't taken off the ferns or the mosses. If you're at the bottom of the wall, sometimes you're not quite sure you should walk through the door. If you look up, you understand why the bottom of the door is not working. If you walk to the very back, you notice, I shouldn't point this out, but I'm going to anyway, we still have asbestos in the garden. It's covered by moss, though. But we'll have to get rid of it one day. This is what our garages look like. We haven't replaced all the windows. The car model is from the 1970s. If you try to leave the garden, you start to see there were some reparations, but some of the edges are not all that good. And this is what's left of our last greenhouse from the 19th century. The others were destroyed. Sometimes walls actually fall down. This was a year ago. This is the same wall from the other direction. This is what it looks like today. We're getting there. It's actually a type of youth build program that we're going to rebuild the wall this summer. Concretely, that means I didn't spend any money to do it. Because the entire garden, which is, I have to remember this, 24 acres, 9.4 hectares, is, I manage it with 40,000 euros, not counting salaries, but the total investment of, functioning money is 40,000 euros, so let's say $50,000 for 24 acres. So, and I still have to mention another big problem. Oh, I forgot, I want to mention something else. This presentation is rather general. And for those of you who would be interested in a history of plant selection and fruits and vegetables, you have to stay for Soho afterwards. Just wanted to mention that. And I also wanted to mention that I was an undergraduate, and that when I was an undergraduate here, I never imagined I'd be coming back for a second time to give a talk here. Just thought I'd have to mention that. The biggest problem is actually not all what I just showed you. The biggest problem is this. The biggest problem we have in this garden is drainage. It was built on an old swamp, and they put in a massive drainage system in the 17th century. It hasn't been properly kept up, and so we're faced with some real questions of root asphyxiation and other difficulties of that type. So those are the problems. But you'll notice that I use this as a punctuation. It's how I change from one subject to another. What are our strengths? So let's do another whirlwind tour of the garden, but this time a little bit better. And we're going to start in an early winter morning, and we're going to go to a late fall afternoon. So if I go towards the sun, I find myself in the alleyways. We're in a regular garden created at the end of the 17th century. This whole system of perspectives, of straight lines, but that aren't all that controlling. If I go forward, I go towards spring. For me, it's the most anxious-ridden part of the year. I think it is for any fruit grower. It's not the moment where I'm working the most, but it's the moment where I sleep the least. If I go through the door and I take a right, I go towards summer. It's the King's Gate in the back. The King's Gate is the last original gate. This gate is the last original gate of the Palace of Versailles. We're going to see more general later, you'll see. This is still the whirlwind tour. If I go around the central basin and I look the other way, I see the cathedral next door, which is younger than the garden. The cathedral dates from 1742. The garden dates from 1678, or was begun to be constructed in 1678. And generally, when I look at this church, the first thing I want to do, and the only thing I really want to do in it, is go to the top. That's what the garden looked like when I arrived about 10 years ago. You'll see a lot of dirt. If you look at more or less the same time of year, a few years later, it's changed. There's a lot more grass, a lot less dirt visible, a lot less herbicide use. We're going to talk about that. If we go towards autumn, you can see some of our fruit tree shapes, some of our cabbage patches that if you look at more closely, this is a Beurre Hardy. It's a middle 19th century pear tree. Although the variety is middle 19th century, the actual tree is about 140 years old. A 5-tiered flat espalier tree. We have 68 different fruit tree shapes in the garden. This is going towards the autumn. The colors change. And this is the setting sun behind the creator of the garden, whose name was Jean-Baptiste Lacantini. Punctuation. Those are my 2 whirlwind tours. Now let's try to get a bit more specific and try to give a context, try to understand the old uses and the new uses of this garden. So this is all of Versailles. This is the palace, and the kitchen garden is right here. And you see the Grand Canal. And a closer look, that was a early 18th century map. This is a middle 19th century map, just because it has a nicer close-up and nicer colors. You can see the kitchen garden better. You can see the extent of the palace. You should realize this is the only thing that's really new about, well, this is a bit mean of me to say. The only thing that's really new about Versailles, basically, is that when you walk this, you've walked 600 meters. So you've walked not quite half a mile, but that's a single facade. The basic innovation of Versailles is its size. After that, there are some technical innovations about how to make flat glass, how to drain, but the basic thing about Versailles is just its size. So it ends up with a kitchen garden, which isn't an acre or 2 acres, but 24 acres. What does it look like today? That's what it looks like today, an aerial view from a few years ago. You can see the size of the palace. You can see the orangerie, which has approximately 2,500 large potted plants that go in and out. And you have the kitchen garden here, with the school that's in the garden along the buildings. Because today, it's a school. We'll get to that. This is just to try to point out how the garden changes. This is a mid-18th century, it's upside down, but you'll see why. This is a mid-18th century map. This is a mid-19th century map. The big differences that aren't all that obvious, okay? Here you have 3 gardens. It's going to become 1 or 2. Here you have diagonal walls. They will disappear. You have 11 gardens here. We still call them the 11 gardens, but there's only 5 because some of the walls got taken out. Okay? There are other differences, but basically the shape has stayed the same. The big difference you can see here is the number of glass houses. In the mid-18th century, there was lots of glass jars, glass bells. I don't know how you call them in English. Cloche. You say cloche? I should have known that. And lots of hotbeds, but there weren't many greenhouses. Actually, I think you see one on the image. The only greenhouse that existed at the time was right here. And in French, the word for greenhouse is serre, S-E-R-R-E, and everyone thinks that that's a greenhouse. Originally, a serre is a place where you resserre, which means that you reorganize. No, you store things. And this was the serre, but it's not a greenhouse. It's where everything was stocked. So why this map? Why is it important, although it's upside down? Because in 1874, which is when mid-19th century, I exaggerate, second half, in 1874, a school was created in the garden. And since 1874, the kitchen garden is no longer under the administration of the palace. So it's been 140 years now that this garden is separate from the palace. Always in a school. When it was first created, it was the National School of French Horticulture. Today, it is the National School for Landscape Architecture. This is the map we show today that we give to our visitors. The idea is you come in over here. This is the entrance today, although the historic entrance is here. You come in here. The departure is always here for the visits, but 2, 3, 4, and we take you around the garden. Today, it's no longer the Landscape Horticulture School, it's the Landscape Architecture School. And the logo for the school, National School of Supérieur, means higher education. It doesn't mean that it's superior to others. It simply means that it's not elementary or secondary school. After secondary school comes supérieur. Universities are supérieur, okay? So it's part of the university system. But the logo for the school is my English is terrible. Is a stylized version of the central square of the kitchen garden, and that for me is very important because it's the question of how do you go from garden to landscape, and the pedagogical, the educational progression of the students in the landscape architecture school go from a first year about creating gardens to a second year about larger urban spaces or larger spaces, and a third year working on coastal or railroad tracks that cross entire landscapes. So the idea is to go from small to large, from microcosm to macrocosm. The school is present in the garden, but you do have to understand or realize that there's some kind of fundamental contradiction between a historical garden and a landscape architecture school. They think of themselves as conceptors, artists, creators, often, at least in France. I'm not sure for here. They're not gardeners. And on the other hand, there's a historic garden that that communicates with them, but in which essentially they come and see things occasionally. Here they discover what soil is. And 3 days a year, they actually work in the garden. This is a rare picture. This is 3 days a year, okay? Actually, it's 3 days a year the first year, 2 days a year the second year, 1 day a year the third year. So one of the main projects in terms of restoring this garden, and I do like landscape architects, don't get me wrong, I just want them to be more aware that once they've created something, you have to manage it. There's a landscape architect in France who you might have heard of, whose name is Gilles Clément, who had a phrase one day that I really liked. He said, landscape architects shouldn't be paid until 10 years after they've given their project. But I don't think landscape architects would agree, and I understand that they wouldn't agree. So how can we make these things work together? Well, if I try to zoom simply on this picture, I see this behind it. And the project to try to make this school work together, work with the garden together, is in that building, in those two buildings, to take some of the spaces that are in them and use them to create a residency for international landscape architects, where they both will be interested in in teaching with the students of the school and also in working with the garden. The idea is that they come and we find a space within the garden to work with them. Try to do the two together. So we're in the process of actually raising money for this, and we've raised not that much, but some. And we will start, we're looking for essentially 3 million euros, and we've already raised over half of it. So we're getting there. It's not we're well on the way. And we'll start construction, we'll start redoing, because you don't see it very well in this picture, but we'll start redoing some of the problems on the windows at the end of the summer, and installing some of the spaces. We will already be receiving some international artists this fall. That's the aerial view, and as usual, my punctuation. Because all this is very important, but what's most important to me is not just the students, it's the gardeners. Because the space doesn't exist without gardeners. Without a garden doesn't exist unless there are gardeners. You can have a forest, you can have spaces without gardeners, but you can't have a garden without gardeners. And what they do. When I arrived in the garden in 2004, both these men were working, Jacques and François. And in 2007, 2008, they retired, both of them. And they had to be replaced. Well, the idea was to replace them before they left, so that there would be some transmission. And they were replaced essentially by these two young men, who've grown a bit older since this picture, to do the same things that were being done before. So we have 68 different fruit tree shapes. This is one that's particular, each one has a name, by the way. And there are actually, we have a list of over 250 that we would like to make, but we've got to keep all of them going. This is one that takes a good 25 years to make. It's called the Vase Médicis. So that's an early 20th century picture. This is an early 21st century picture. This is a fruit variety from the middle of the 17th century, one of the ones that was originally cultivated by La Cantini, so the creator of the garden, and that we still have in the garden today. This is this is a mid-18th century print, but this is a 17th century pear that we still have in the garden today, and that I chose to show with our 450 different historical, well, not just historical, 450 different fruit varieties. If I go to vegetables, the person who is now responsible, generally responsible, what I call the captain, is Christine Dufour. I always feel like I don't do my job properly if I don't talk about the gardeners. They're the ones who are outside when it's cold, not me. I'm here with you. I hope to come back here this summer with her. We'll see if it works or not. Somehow or other, I'm in the position of a coach. I try to give a perspective. I try to create a plan. I try to make sure that they can work. But she's the one who gets the work done. What do they do? Well, she's particularly on vegetables, but she also takes care of the fruit. This is the vegetable team in their different areas of predilection, whether it be herbs, greater production, or tropical plants for David. We use old catalogs not so much to recreate, but to have ideas about what worked then, what works now. So in 1909, among the most popular tomato fruits were this one here. Which one? La poire. Le 7 et le 8. There it is, 5 is what I'm looking. I'll get it. And we still have it in the garden now. We have, generally, every year, I was talking to Mr. Christopher Dunn this morning about how he functions with the vegetable garden, and we do much the same thing, actually. We can't do everything every year. It's not possible. So we try to have a selection of between 300 and 400 vegetable varieties every year. And the idea is to have some that what we call collection, we try them out, and some that we are producing. And you'll see why I talk about that in just a moment, because we sell everything we produce. I forgot where I was. So we have some in collection, some in production, anywhere between 300 and 400 varieties. Every year, every 2 years, we try to choose one that we get to know better. So we will do 1 year 80 tomato varieties, but generally we do between 25 and 30. We do the same thing, for example, for beans. This is a late 18th century drawing. We have beans. Just want to remind you that it was a tropical plant at one point. We did 1 year, we had over 100 varieties of beans. And everybody thinks that these are in terms of the people who come to visit the garden. Yes, they're also for the gardeners, because for them to know about beans, they have to try them out. And if we want to be able to answer questions from our visitors, we have to have the knowledge. So if we only stick on the 15 or 20 bean varieties we're used to, we can't answer the questions of the people who come to see us. So every year we try to take eggplant or peppers or scallions, onions. We try to do, every year, try out as many as we can find. But generally, in terms of what we produce for regular production, we're about 100 varieties. But we go up to 300 or 400 depending on the year we're doing. But we're not just fruits and vegetables. There is a small group one or two gardeners who work on general uptake. We have a small, do you say rosary? You say we have a small rosary of about 60 different varieties. We have about 800 different taxons of ornamental plants. On purpose or not on purpose, they're there. The older person who was there in 2004, the younger person who's there now. We have a young team. What do they take care of? Well, we have this 200 long meter terrace that has two sides of boxwood. That's what it looks like in winter. That's what it looks like in summer. That's already a bit of work. And there's box in many other parts of the garden as well that needs to be taken care of. Is there a boxwood blight here as well? I want to tear them up anyway. They smell like piss in the summer, in the spring. And they're totally unproductive, and they're not existent in this garden in the 17th century. They were introduced in the 19th. And I want to replace them by herbal, aromatic herbal borders. The gardeners are in revolt against me because it's more work. And basically, that's the only thing I can say about box, is that the reason box exists is it's less work than the rest. I hope the people who like box don't disagree too much, but I haven't found another reason for box yet. We have a frutisetum, which is in some sense what's left over from the horticultural school when it was there. And these are two of my favorite plants in the frutisetum. We have 174 ornamental shrubs that are stuck in a corner of the garden. That's a Xanthoxylum simulans, which is a Sichuan pepper, and a Poncirus, with my French accent, Poncirus trifoliata, so Poncirus, whatever all the orange trees are grafted on. But it makes great yellow fruit that you can grate or use to aromatize, to flavor jams, and I'll talk about that in a little while too. But the real point of all these gardeners is this. The real point of this kitchen garden has always been to be a kitchen garden, because so far that's not what I've shown you. We produce about 40 tons of fruit, we produce about 20 to 25 tons of vegetables, and it all gets sold in a small space at the entrance. Some people think that's a lot. I think it's very little for 24 acres. The gardeners think it's a lot of work, and I understand them. But I did a simple calculation just the other day. If I take 40 tons of fruit and I transform about 15 into juice and jam, that only leaves me with 25 tons. If I have a 10% loss, 20% loss, storage, everything else, I'm down to 20 tons. And if I tried to do that over 52 weeks, I come out with only 150 kilos a week. That's not that much. So 40 tons is not very much. Oh, I talked about jams. I have a present for Don, and I have a present for Soho, but they'll have to choose how they want to work. This is our mug, and this is two of our jams, two pear varieties. So you'll have to choose afterwards. But that's what we do. That's what we do. That is how we make our money. That's how we equilibrate our budget. It's a public garden. It's owned by the state, but we have to make a living. And I think that's very important in terms of public garden management, the idea that a garden can be productive, can be visited, and can produce. We do everything. Jams, we make the jams ourselves. We also dry our own peppers, we make our own Herbe de Provence mix, and we even have partnerships with a tea company. This is our mug. We even have a partnership with a tea company where we have a particular apple variety which I adore, which is called, and it's called Canada, Renette du Canada Blanc et Gris. But nobody wants to buy anymore in France because it's wonderful cooked, but people don't cook apples anymore. They always want to eat them fresh. They want to eat them raw. It's very difficult to sell several tons of this apple, but it has a wonderful flavor and a great aroma. We found a solution. We sell it to a tea company. They extract the aroma. They use it to flavor their teas. It's our biggest seller. I'm trying to remember what I haven't told you yet, and in terms of the time. Okay. And once I talk about food, what I think is probably the most important thing, people come to this garden because it's a historic garden. They come there because it's Versailles. They come because Louis XIV, and there's this image, there's this trademark. Here you have David, the one who likes tropical fruits and who's also one of our best ambassadors. They come for that reason, but we want them to leave with a better understanding of today's contemporary stakes for fruit and vegetable production and consumption. How does it function? I mean, I've taken groups of, I used to think this wasn't true, but I've taken groups of not so young children into the garden and shown them the potato plant and had them say to me, "Where's the potato?" And I've shown them pea plants, and I've even taken adults into the garden and showed them a spinach plot, and the person said, "Where are the spinach?" And I realized that the person could recognize it when it was on a shelf, because it was separated, it was only spinach. But when it was mixed in with galansoga or with something else and it was close to the ground, they couldn't recognize it. So basically, when they come in the garden, they come to see a historic garden. We want them to leave with a better understanding of fruits and vegetables. So that's what I'm going to try to do now. This is David talking to a group. This is what we try to show to our groups. This is an exhibition we did in 2007 about fruit varieties. It was we took 3 editions of a book from 1768, was republished in the early 19th century, and we tried to put the varieties that were in the book out, and we tried to show that the 3 versions of the same book didn't describe them the same way, and that somehow or other people should give up on trying to give a specific name to a variety. We did an exhibition about beans, where I discovered something rather important, for me at least. Those beans, green beans that were bred to flower at the same time, be harvested at the same time, to stand up to transformation into whatever, are often not good when you eat them after transformation. But when they're actually out there and you eat them fresh, you can pick them yourself, they're actually excellent. So the problem really is on the processing side, because some of the industrial varieties that everybody is screaming about, that they're not good when they're in the processed food, can be excellent when they're in the field. And I thought that in terms of trying to understand how our agriculture functions, that's an important point, to say that modern varieties are not necessarily bad. They can have some real interest, including taste. The question is how they're used afterwards. So maybe we have to not just yell at the farmers, we have to try to educate people to cook better. We did an exhibition. This was purely for the landscape architecture students. This is what I call thumbing my nose. We did an exhibition about pollination because I was tired of getting comments about landscape architects who didn't know about plants being allergenic. And I did a presentation in front of the Board of Trustees of the school, and I mentioned a landscape architect who had planted a schoolyard with lots of birch trees. And birch trees are among the most allergenic. What I didn't know when I did this presentation was that the president of the Board of Trustees was that landscape architect. But it still went over fine because the students did learn that plants were allergenic. How to bring people to the garden. We've been having, this will be our 8th or 9th year, it's a school. It's a school of landscape architecture. We have a festival, a modern art festival in a historical garden every year. It's essentially dance. It's essentially conceptual dance in a movement in France called non-dance. And I think that's wonderful. I think it's a great example of bringing people to a historical space to remind them this historical space is always about being new. It's not about being old. And when it was created to be new. So let's keep using it as a space that's new. Every year we have an annual harvest festival. You can't do without it. It's the moment of the year where we have the most amount of things to sell, and so we need a lot of people to buy them. And it's also the moment where we can show the most diverse things of what we do. So every year, first weekend of October, we try to present the 70 or 80 varieties of fruit that are still available that we can sell at that point, and as many varieties of vegetables. This is an example, and this is where we get to how do we cultivate. I look at the hour. Most people will see Louise Bonne, which is one of my favorite pears on the left, and Calville Blanc, which is one of my favorite apples on the right. I often compare Calville Blanc to Jonah Gold as the example, as the difference between Bordeaux and California. Uh-oh, I got myself into a... Now I have to tell you why. I don't usually say that one, but... California wine. This was, where's Adam? No, there he is. For me, it's big, juicy fruit right away. It's wonderful. It's how to say, c'est éclatant. It's an explosion. And if you're used to California Cabernet Sauvignon and you drink a Bordeaux, generally you're disappointed. It's like, what, it's not as big. It's not... Jonah Gold, when you taste it, it explodes in your mouth. It's a wonderful apple. You taste the Calvi Blanc, and the first thing you say is, oh, it's an apple. And then 30 seconds later, you say, wait, there's still a taste there. There's a little bit of fennel, there's a little bit of mint, but the apple is strong, and then 2 minutes later, it's still in your nose, and you're saying, what's it still doing there? That's the difference between a California Cabernet and a Bordeaux Cabernet. Calville. But that's not what I see. I'll show you what I see. I hope that some of you see it too. How many people see apples or pears on the market with scab? That's what we do all the time. And I hope that people can get used to it. We're not organic, but we do spray. And even if we do spray with organic, they still have to get dressed up that way. And we call it our Chernobyl suits. And how do you do that in a public garden? Above and beyond, I do not know the rules in the States, but in our case, there's, even on copper sulfate, there's a 24-hour limit before going on to, how do you do that in a public garden that's open 7 days a week? And how do you do it when you're in a public garden that produces fruits and vegetables, and next to the trees you have strawberries, and just stay on copper sulfate, if I remember right, it's 21 days before harvest. What do you do? Well, you can say you sprayed the trees and not the strawberries. So you can still bring the strawberries to the store. Ethically, I'm not up for it. Okay? How do we do it? Well, we find solutions one way or another. Our first solution is we no longer treat the central square where the fruit trees and the vegetables are in the same place. I have not asked for an organic label. We've noted a 60% lowering in harvest, but we're still making it. And we're going to probably do something that's going to shock, not you, but shock the people I work for, or the people who are guarantees in terms of the state for the preservation of historic monuments. I'd like to tear out the pear trees and put in plum trees. Slightly different shape. Two arguments. First of all, it'll give us time to know how to cultivate pear trees without treating them, because for the moment we don't know. And plum trees will only last 25 years in espaliered shape, so it's just a time period. And the second reason is because plum trees, we can treat them during the winter when we don't have many visitors, and they are vigorous enough to survive most attacks until we harvest them in July. We'll see. But it has been 320, 340 years now that the central square has been cultivated with pear trees, and some people take me to be a bit radical. The other choice, of course, is to find solutions to Phytophthora. That's what I worked on when I was here at Cornell. I spent hours in the lab trying to try to find mutant spores. Well, we do treat them with copper sulfate, but we do it very specifically in specific situations and not all the time. And sometimes we even do it when visitors are there, because it's a way for them to go, and to talk to them. Because in the States, if I remember right, only 2% of the population is agricultural today. In France, it's not that much more, it's 4%. There is a huge educational challenge in terms of getting people to know where what they eat comes from. It's also when, and this is, I chose on purpose 4 here, Galansoga is a North American plant. This is a cucurbit, also a North American plant, or American plant. Where are the squash in there? Have to get people used to seeing that too. And even the gardener's happy when he finds one. They react poorly to this. They react poorly to the one before. This is my favorite way of dealing with weeds in a garden, at least in our garden. I think it's perfectly fine. I think that if we did the entire garden in black plastic, that's woven though, and biodegradable, but I don't think people would appreciate it either. But this is how we deal in a historic garden with producing tomatoes, peppers. We do some green manure, and when they see this, they don't understand. When they see this, they understand a bit better, but I'm not that much more satisfied, because if we have too much Facilia tenisfutifolia, whatever, in the fall, we create problems for our honeybees, because they're going to be harvesting later. They're not going to be able to dry out the nectar as long, and we're going to have honey that freezes. So we have to be careful about our green manure as well. People complain when they come to the garden and they see this. I complained to the garden when I arrived and I saw this, because that's how it was dealt with before. We're now at 0 herbicide use, but we do have more grass. And I think the next 3 pictures are probably what I would like to show you most, and probably the whole presentation was just for these 3. Wonderful fruit tree shapes. What do we do with our soil? This is herbicide use since 1969. That's when Jacques, who I showed you on the first picture, arrived. He spent a year with a hoe in his hand, and he got sick of it, and he started using herbicides. The garden was cultivated with herbicides almost entirely up until 2004, 2005. In 2006, we said we have to stop. But we had to find solutions. That was the first idea. But it took a lot of work. Geotextile, the idea was to have something clean underneath the plant. Something where we could still continue to see the tree, because we're also dealing with aesthetics. The solution we have today is this one, because we found a machine for mechanical cultivation under the trees that we adapted from vineyard culture. We still have to mow the lawn, but we have other ideas for that where we let some of them flower. But the basic question is, what are we doing in a historical garden? How does this function? Are we a professional fruit growers searching for solutions for professional fruit growing? Are we a historical garden trying to be faithful to what the people did 300 years ago? And my answer is both. We have to find solutions to both. 300 years ago, they were already producing in large quantities for the king's table. Today, we have to continue producing in large quantities. 300 years ago, they had visitors. Today, we have visitors. We have to keep those two together. We both have to take into account modern techniques, modern limits, and we also have to remember the intentions with which it was created. And for me, the difference between this picture and this picture is a difference in how we relate to our environment. In the first picture, we're producing fruits. That's it. We have fruit tree shapes, but we're producing fruit. In this picture, we're managing a space. And as soon as we start managing a space that has ideas about production, we're also producing other things. We're also taking care, and this is very easy to say, and I'm sure you've heard this lots of times, but we're taking part of an ecosystem, and we're taking part of both cultivated and wild. This is the largest wild French solitary bee at Xylocoque. We have a huge population of this Merita leporina that nobody really understands why we have it in the garden, and I've tried to study it a little bit, and it's an interesting conundrum. We have it because we used herbicides, because it likes sandy soil that doesn't have plant on it. They want to make its burrows, to make its nests. And so when we no longer use herbicide, we are in part eliminating this wild bee. We'll have to find some solutions. Beneficial insects, of course, chrysops. I couldn't resist. Sorry for the eternal ladybug and its strawberry. I always thought the walls in the garden were there for, heat. That's what everybody, when I arrived in this garden, everyone told me the walls are there to accumulate heat. I think the walls are there to accumulate beneficial insects and vertebrae that eat the ones we don't want. Because I think in terms of the heat, it works. It works even better when you try to put the tomato plants out in the middle of the garden, and you put the tomato plants against the wall, even a north-facing wall, you still have healthier tomato plants. I think it has to do with its environment. We even have a hawk that I found, that I got a picture of the other day, so I had to include it. I'm going to go very quickly. The garden is inserted in the town. We have one side, this one side is the park. The three other sides are in the city. So if we use some kind of general neem or a pyrethra, or when we used to be able to use rotinones, you're always blowing, excuse my language, you're always blowing all the insects away. And we have no way of recuperating them other than within our own garden. So when you're in this kind of, urban desert on one side or diversity desert on the other, you have to find ways of creating diversity within the garden itself. This is the Fruiticetum, this there where we have all the different shrubs. That's part of it. It looks a bit more unkempt than you can imagine Versailles to generally be. Well, that's the garden I work in. We've included some, within the fruit growing areas, we've included some non-productive hedges, and we really see the difference between the side, and it's not proven scientifically, though I'd love someone to come study it with us. The impression the gardeners and I have is that the side towards the shrub, towards the non-productive hedge, is less attacked than the one that's not. And we've had that same experience with our prairies that we've sometimes replaced the grass with because we got sick of mowing, or rather, the budget couldn't deal with all the mowing. In this case, we intervened 3 times in the year, once to prepare, once to seed, and once to mow, as opposed to mowing every 12 days. And we do that in several places throughout the garden. This is my favorite current experiment. This was a picture from just 3 weeks ago. I transformed a space that was just below the offices of the director of the school that used to be a lawn, okay? And just below the windows of the last year students into a permaculture experiment. And it's quite, I shouldn't say after working with some of the students of the school and the gardeners, this is how we transformed it. So we're working on, actually it's based on a Québécois. I see someone nodding their head, I'm trying to remember his name, Fortin. There's a vegetable producer just outside of Quebec who's written a book in both French and English that takes up on Elliot Coleman's book. And we're using some of those techniques there. Elliot Coleman and Fortin using books from the middle of the 19th century from Parisian gardeners. We even have some, not just insects, but some geese and some chickens that help out. I call them they're our gardeners as well. We have some sheep that I hope you're not going to be shocked by this, that we regularly kill and barbecue. That's also part of educating in terms of food. It always gets me angry when people they don't want to see the carcass. Angry is not the right word. It disappoints me. I think we really have food education to be done. I don't think everyone should be carnivorous. My companion is a vegetarian. It just thinks about knowing where things come from before making decisions. This is my dream, actually. I'm almost finished. I've been pretty good. People often think that we do exhibitions for people to see outside. I do exhibitions because I want the gardeners to see what we're doing or where we should be going. I think we could probably eliminate some of our tractors. We have small garden tractors with some donkeys. And I think we'll get there in the next 2 or 3 years, actually, because it's a different relationship to the space. It's a different way of working, and it's a great way to try to make more people come to this garden to see how we do it. Don't forget, it's about food. It's about gardeners. It's in a wonderful space, and it will always be a school. Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.